Hey everybody, Questwise here, and today we're going to continue our series on the low fantasy gaming extravaganza. I don't know what they even really call this series anymore. We are now part 3. The first time we talked about the game as a whole. The second time we talked about the classes that are available. Today, as promised, I want to talk about what I was calling the siege. And by that I mean I'm looking at the mass combat rules that come with the game. I've always been a fan of. I used to play a lot of tabletop miniature wargaming and stuff. A lot of Warhammer, but as well, I did a lot of like bolt action, a lot of historical stuff. And so I love games that sort of simulate large battles or semi-large battles, skirmishes, if you will. Um, and so it always appeals to me when a role-playing game, a tabletop role-playing game, incorporates rules for those sorts of things. And low fantasy gaming has a very, 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 very cool system on how to run mass combat. And what I really like about it is it's very player focused. It makes you want to focus upon the player characters and what they're doing. And we'll get to the siege part at the end of this video. I'm going to talk about how I want to use these rules to sort of run, or how I would run a sort of siege type of scenario within a role-playing game, using units of troops and that kind of stuff, maneuvering around and ideas for that kind of thing. But first, let's talk a little bit more about what makes the rules in low fantasy gaming for mass combat sort of unique. First of all, I already said it really focuses on the characters. And that's important because you don't want to be running a character and then, come to a situation where you're running a mass battle and they sort of fade into the background and you're playing some other kind of game, right? You're here to play a role-playing game and you want your characters to be at sort of the forefront of that story. And in that, these mass combat rules really incorporate that. And here's some ways why, or how, that they incorporate those characters. So your characters will be instrumental in the sort of mass combat. So let's take the siege, for instance, all right? So we have a castle. Let's say our characters are on the inside of the castle. They're being besieged by another enemy army or enemy's forces. And these can be anything. These can be just normal troops, or these can be, creatures. Think of things like, Helm's Deep from Lord of the Rings, that kind of stuff. But we're going to focus and say our characters are inside the castle, inside the fortification of some sort, and they're trying to either survive or drive off those who are sieging this place. So there's certain things that happen. There are critical events that happen, and they happen twice a turn. You roll on this chart. There's 20 to choose from, right? You roll a d20, or as a game master, you can sort of just choose 2 of these per turn. And there are little things like assuming command, innocence in peril, with me brothers. So there's these actions that your characters can take, or these things that happen. So assuming command means that your character or characters must sort of join in and take over a unit of men, a unit of troops, and lead them into battle or whatever situation that currently might be happening. Some of these are good, some of these are bad, right? So assuming command is something that, puts your character, again, at the forefront of the action, and lets them role play out this idea that they're in charge of a unit of people. Innocence in peril is kind of a nice thing as well, too. Say, during the siege, a catapult launches a rock over the wall, and it crushes a nearby building, and you can tell that there are people, innocent people, still trapped inside. That's one variation of that idea. But the idea that your characters now have a situation where they have to help innocent people, and how that sort of changes the direction of the game a little bit. Things like With Me Brothers is something in which you're trying to rally troops. You're trying to get people to follow you. You're trying to get people to realize, hey, we've got this. We've got, we just need to do it this a certain way. Let's band together, raise their morale, as it were, and push forward. So there's ideas like that, and it emulates really cool cinematic events. And I already mentioned the Battle of Helm's Deep, but think of things like the Battle of the Bastards from Game of Thrones, right? These are very big cinematic events of things that you want to sort of move quickly through, but you also want them to be sort of the forefront action of that particular scenario. So, you know, taking command might be this valiant charge. You've decided that there's a point in the siege when you're going to open the gates and push this vanguard through to try and break the troops as they were on the other side. The other thing that's really, really interesting about this rule set is another D20 chart called the sudden twists. And these are things that whenever a PC, a player character, is near a conflict and they're rolling a die for some certain skill or action, and they happen to roll a 1 or a 20, you get to, as a game master, unleash these sudden twists. And these things are like lost weapons, spoils of war, obscurement. So there's things that can be good or bad on this chart as well too. So spoils of war might be, you know, you find a hidden cache of weapons, or you know, an explosive, maybe that they had tried to break their way through the wall with some kind of an explosive device, and you found it's undisturbed, and you might be able to use that to your advantage. And you know, lost weapon, those kind of things. Look out, sir, I think was another one as well too, where you're near the action, you're in the midst of all this thing going on, and there's arrows whizzing by, or you swing your sword and it's wet and you lose your grip on it and it goes flying, and now you're, you know, defenseless. You know, obscurement, things like that, like there's this haze of fog or smoke and you can't clearly see the enemy. So there's cool little sudden twists that the game master can throw in there on top of the players in the midst of their action, which adds to that cool cinematic effect of the scenario being played. Then there's the idea of using units, of commanding units, of moving units around. The way that I've done this in the past with role-playing games is that I've set up either a playmat, like a gridded playmat, or just a tabletop as well. I've used paper chits before to represent different units. My favorite way is to go and buy small wooden blocks and paint them different colors for the different units. Maybe write on the top of them with a Sharpie to denote what kind of unit they are. But there are 5 different units that can be found in low fantasy gaming, all with stats and stuff as well too. There are militias, which are, you know, normal people brought together to help try to fight, so they're not very good. There's infantry, there's heavy infantry, archers, and cavalry. And there's a way, he discusses in the book ways of which how to use those and how they should be used well. One of my favorite things about fantasy role-playing games, and this is how I really got started, this is why I went to go study history in college, was the emulation of sort of historical events. Even though we're using things like elves and dragons and ogres and that kind of stuff, giants, there's sort of still this idea of medieval history sort of baked into fantasy wargaming, or any other kind of, you know, any other kind of role-playing as well too. But there's this idea that really drove me to go and study and research and learn about history, about things like mass combat and how battles worked in, you know, medieval times. Things like how castles worked, what defenses were like, the difference between a catapult and a trebuchet, those kinds of things. And they really drove me on. Some of the earlier games that I played, especially the Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition Player's Handbook, they would have these little sidebars and talk about things like who was Richard the Lionheart, and you know, who was Merlin, and it would really drive me to go and try to research these characters and these places and these times and stuff. And I think that what's really interesting about this game here in low fantasy gaming is that he really kind of grasped that idea of this kind of, this is a fantasy game, but we're also talking about historical situations. And so, you know, this might drive you on, if you're doing some sort of an idea of like a siege, to read about sieges and see how those really took place. You know, read the book about the siege of Acre during the Crusades, and read about how those took place, the besieging armies and stuff as well too, and the things that would happen to the people on either side of the conflict. And so by doing this, by actually setting up, you know, wooden blocks or paper chits on a board, on a grid, and as a group of players being in charge of these units, or, you know, being in charge of these groups of warriors, deciding, you know, how they move and how they you know, how your tactics are going to be as this thing unfolds, is really, really cool. And I love that he gives you all the stats for those different types of units and how they work, and, you know, how some are better than others and stuff as well too. And then there comes the final confrontation. So at some point during this scenario, the game master will say, this is the final confrontation. This will end this scenario. Whether it be the end of that battle or the end of the siege, whether the defenders are able to withhold or break the enemy army, or whether the besieging army actually is able to break through. And it's all sort of dependent upon the previous scenarios and the critical events and the sudden twists and that kind of stuff. To see just exactly what is happening and decide, as this whole final conflict plays out, sort of the boss battle of a mass combat kind of a thing. So in a siege, what I was thinking of was using the rules, but twisting them a bit, maybe making a few new charts. So if we're playing the characters who are trying to protect the people inside the castle, you could quickly come up with another chart, maybe a D10 chart, maybe even a D20 if you're feeling really ambitious. But things like, and again, good things and bad things. So you could have things like, you've realized after a day, because sieges last sometimes for days, for weeks, for months. And so the idea was that you're going to starve these people out. You're going to break their will, right? And that they eventually would just surrender. So one of the twists that you could have to add to a sort of a siege type scenario is that you could have the player characters realize that the supplies, food supplies, water supplies, whatever, are running low in the castle, and things become ratcheted up, right? The intensity of the moment sort of rises, and you realize that these people are going to starve to death if they don't get food soon, or they're going to riot against you and just give up and go out and put up the white flag and surrender to this enemy army. Because there's nothing more debilitating to people's morale than starving to death while the people outside are cooking and eating and having, whatever. Another thing you could have, another twist could be that you're out of ammunition. Maybe you have some defenses in the castle or the fortress, the fortified place that you're in. Maybe you've run out of cannonballs, or if you're using cannons, there's rules in there for black weapons or black powder weapons and stuff as well too. At what point do you run out of rocks to throw from your catapults or your trebuchets, and you begin to use dead bodies or dead animals and stuff as well, which is a historical thing that was actually done. Sometimes they would throw rotten corpses over the walls to try to either scare off the besieging army, or vice versa, to sort of add disease to the thing. Warfare is a horrible, horrible, horrible thing. So this is something also you might want to take care of to kind of prepare your players for, depending on how sort of realistic and gritty you want to get with it, or if you want to stay on a more fantastical level and say that they're Pegasus flying over, that kind of stuff, dragons, those types of things. But you want to kind of know your players and kind of decide, how gritty you want to get with those things. But it could be very, very grotesque. It could be things like heavy rains, which for the people inside the castle is not a really big deal, right? They have places to go to if it rains really heavily. But that for the besieging army, that makes the ground very, very sloppy and muddy and gross and hard to maneuver, and it dampens bowstrings, which makes them virtually ineffective. All those kinds of things can hamper. If you're using black powder weapons, black powder when wet doesn't work very well. So, you can have those ideas that it starts to rain very heavily. You could have things like heavy fog, which might be a bonus to the player characters who are stuck inside the castle, because now they have the ability to either sneak out and try to scout the enemy army, or to do like assassination runs kind of thing on the enemies without them being seen sort of leaving the castle and such as well too. That could be a 50-50 back and forth as well too, because that means that the besieging army could also do some extra planning and maneuvering things in the fog that the player characters on the inside would not be able to see. But if you haven't already jumped on the bandwagon for this game, you totally should. And there's so much more going on in this book than just the little things that I've touched on so far. Next time, we're going to talk about magic and how magic works in the game. If you've played any other D20 games, you'll be pretty familiar with it, but there are some cool twists that I want to show you about this game as well too. So until next time, I am Questwise, and I am out.